What's up, beautiful people? Today we are taking a quick look at the essential information you need to know about World War I. First, it's important to remember, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, new U.S. territorial ambitions and acquisitions in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific accompanied heightened public debates over America's role in the world. All of these presidents were actively involved in international affairs, but when World War I broke out, our traditional policy of isolationism and neutrality was evoked. There were a variety of factors which contributed to the outbreak of World War I. We're not going to get into them here, but of course they could be broken down into the acronym MAIN: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. And when the war broke out, Wilson advocated a policy of neutrality. Now, neutrality proved difficult. We had our connection to England, shared language, legal and political institutions. American economic aid largely went to the Allies. Most importantly, there were continued violations of U.S. neutrality. You are going to see in both World War I and World War II, the U.S. attempted to stay neutral initially. We never show up on time to these world wars. Now, the path to U.S. entry into World War I. As mentioned, violations of American neutrality took place. This is really Germany's use of submarine warfare. May 1915, the British ship Lusitania was sunk. This act killed nearly 1,200 passengers, including 128 Americans, and Germany did say sorry, but other ships such as the Sussex were also sunk. Not wanting to propel the U.S. into the war, there was a temporary halt of German attacks on civilian ships, but they restarted unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 with the hope that they could turn the tide of the war and win the war before the U.S. gets involved. Another reason for U.S. entry into World War I is the Zimmermann Telegram. In January of 1917, Germany proposed a secret alliance to Mexico. In this deal, Germany promised Mexico the opportunity to retake land previously belonging to Mexico prior to the Mexican-American War. Another factor is Wilson's desire to defend humanitarian and democratic principles. When Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, he stated the world must be made safe for democracy, and his 14 points proposal demonstrated he had an idealistic vision for the post-war world. More on that plan in a little bit. One thing to also keep in mind is when the war is over, it will increasingly be stated that there were also financial motivations for U.S. entry into World War I. Remember, the U.S. loaned a lot more money to the Allies than the Central Powers. Make sure you know that World War I was fought not only on the battlefields of Europe, but also on the home front. Make sure you know, although the American Expeditionary Forces played a relatively limited role in combat, the U.S. entry helped tip the balance of the conflict in favor of the Allies. The Selective Service Act is passed in May of 1917, which organized the draft. Millions of American men will register for the draft. And the American Expeditionary Forces were led by John J. Pershing, and they fought in the Western Front of World War I. They're going to play an important role once the Russians backed out of the war. Remember, they have the Russian Revolution. Germany made a last-ditch attempt to take France. And it will be American soldiers that will play an important role in some key battles to help stop the German advances. So American soldiers do help in some key battles late in the war, but war supplies and loans were America's greatest contributions to the Allied victory. World War I will be a total war. This means a war in which the government will take control over various aspects of the home front, and the war will be largely financed by war bonds and income taxes from the 16th Amendment. Another aspect of the total war you should keep in mind is there will be various federal agencies such as the War Industries Board, National War Labor Board, and U.S. Food Administration, which will rally the country around the war effort at home. Another important thing to keep in mind is Wilson was deeply involved in post-war negotiations. I mean, he even arrived in France to a parade. Random thought. It would be dope if somebody threw a parade just because you were coming to that particular destination. Remember, Wilson hoped World War I would be the war to end all wars, and even before he went to Versailles, he had proposed his 14 points. Wilson's 14 points reflected an idealistic vision for the post-war world and were intended to make the goal of a war to end all wars a reality. Amongst the 14 points were calls to guarantee freedom of the seas, eliminate economic trade barriers, military reduction, no more colonies, giving people the right to self-determination, self-government, no colonization, and no more secret treaties. Many of these things were seen as factors that contributed to World War I, and Wilson hoped if at Versailles they could get a peace deal agreeing to make these idealistic goals a reality, future wars could be avoided. In addition, Wilson called for the formation of a a League of Nations to help prevent another world war. Unfortunately for Wilson, most of the 14 points were rejected by England, France, and the other Allied powers. Allied countries were looking to get revenge on their enemies and saw the defeat of the Central Powers as an opportunity to strengthen their own country's position not only in Europe, but in all sorts of places around the world. The US Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or to join the League of Nations. There is a big fight in the US Senate, and as mentioned, Republicans controlled the Senate and they were divided into a couple of groups. The irreconcilables wanted the US to continue its isolationist, non-involvement policies towards Europe. They wanted nothing to do with the League of Nations, whereas the reservationists, led by Henry Cabot Lodge and others, were willing to consider joining the League if some modifications were made. Many of those modifications had to do with their constitutional objections to Article 10. This article of the League of Nations would have denied Congress the right to declare war by mandating military involvement in any war against aggressor nations. What this meant was they feared the League would force the US to deal with foreign issues around the world and take away some of the autonomy of the United States Congress. As a result of these concerns and Wilson's unwillingness to compromise, both the Treaty of Versailles and the US joining the League of Nations was defeated. But World War I and its aftermath intensified ongoing debates about the nation's role in the world and how best to achieve national security and pursue American interest. What you will see in the post-World War I world is a dramatically reduced role in world affairs for the United States. There will be a degree of isolationism, and I put isolationism in parentheses since the US will not be entirely withdrawn from all world affairs in the 1920s. For example, you will see an attempt at arms control at the Washington Conference in 1921, but largely after World War I, the US is going to try to stay the heck out of any major foreign conflicts or agreements. In fact, when another world war breaks out in 1939, we will spend the time period from 1939 to 1941 trying to avoid another world war. However, we will not be successful at avoiding the sequel to World War I, as we will enter after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and unlike after World War I, at the end of World War II, we will play a much more active role on the world stage. We will be a superpower along with the Soviet Union, and of course this will usher in the era of the Cold War, and we will get ourselves involved into some conflicts in Korea and Vietnam and a whole bunch of other places. If you want to learn way more information, in the description we have a link to a video that goes into more detail about World War I. If the video helped you out, make sure you click like, tell a friend about the channel, and have a beautiful day. Peace.